Is the United States scrambling for influence in West Asia? Because Pentagon has dispatched advisors, urban warfare experts, as well as sophisticated air defense systems to Israel. The US seems to be prepping Israel for a potential ground invasion of Gaza, a densely populated Palestinian enclave where Hamas operates. The Pentagon, with all its military might and expertise, is helping Israel in war planning. Among the officers sent into this maelstrom is Marine Corps Lieutenant General James Glynn. Glynn's battlefield credentials speak for themselves. He's faced down the Islamic State. He has served in Fallujah, Iraq, during some of the most ferocious urban combat moments. His mission, to guide the Israeli authorities on how to navigate urban warfare. He has one crucial objective, and that is minimizing civilian casualties. The clock is ticking and the stage is set. Israel seems to have set its sights on a large-scale ground operation. It is preparing to wage war in an environment where Hamas militants have had years to prepare tunnels and deadly traps. Glynn, along with the other battle-hardened military officers, brings a wealth of experience that is tailor-made for the kind of operations that Israel is currently embarking on. Yet, let's be clear, the American advisors will remain on the sidelines. They will not engage in frontline combat. At least that's what they say. The military team is one of the many fast-moving pieces that the Pentagon is getting in place to try and prevent the conflict from becoming a wider war. It is also trying to shield US personnel that they have in the last few days come under repeated attacks. The US has described these attacks as Iran-sponsored. In response to these attacks, the Pentagon has announced sending its Patriot missile defense systems. It has also repositioned its Eisenhower strike group. The US Navy will have a carrier strike group off the shore of Israel, the Ford Carrier Strike Group, that is. Now, furthermore, the US has advised Israeli officials to delay its ground assault. The reason? It will give more time, allowing the US to work with regional partners and release more hostages. The US is sending experts, advanced weapons, it says, to help Israel in its fight in Gaza. But the goal seems to be very clear. No power, no group, and no nation can be or will be allowed to undermine America's influence in the region. Are the British too snooty to do their own laundry? For almost a century now, the Royal Navy has been employing Chinese servants on warships. What for? To wash their clothes. Since the 1930s, hundreds of Chinese laundrymen have worked on Britain's warships. Most were hired from Hong Kong. They would wash and iron sailors' uniforms, even their white tablecloths. But now the UK is ending this tradition. Why? Amid fears of espionage. The Royal Navy fears that Chinese laundrymen may have been forced to spy for Beijing, that China could threaten the servants' families back home to make those on board ships pass on Royal Navy secrets. These are the same helpers who have fought wars alongside the British Navy. Many have even paid with their lives. Now, you would think, with the Chinese servants gone, maybe British officers will deal with their own laundry on their own, or at least employ helpers from their own country. That it would be a wake-up call, a break in the cycle. But let me be clear, that's not the case. It seems it is fellow Britons, rather below Britons, especially those in power, to wash their clothes. The Navy will now employ Nepalese Gorkhas to do the job. On a voyage to the South China Sea, 3 Chinese men were blocked from serving on the HMS Queen Elizabeth, which the Royal Navy's flagship aircraft carrier reports say a 4th Chinese laundryman was also dismissed this month after 39 years of service. Why? Because his family lives in Hong Kong. Only those Chinese nationals whose families have moved to Britain are being allowed to work. Officials say the Navy has no choice but to cut their historic ties with Chinese laundrymen. What is the UK so afraid of? Ken McCallum, the head of the MI5, warns that China is attempting to steal nuclear technology secrets from the UK. By doing so, it wants to disrupt the AUKUS security pact. McCallum has also issued similar warnings over espionage in the past. You see, the Royal Navy wants Asians to do their menial tasks. It wants their servants to look a certain way. But hiring Chinese laundrymen is too big of a risk now. So, it is making do with Gorkhas. You would think that colonialism is behind us. But is it really? Well, the Great Britain never fails to surprise us. Joining me now to discuss this and a lot more is Morgan Veena. She is the former Chief of Staff to the US Ambassador at the United Nations, Nikki Haley. Morgan is also the Vice President of Government Affairs at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Welcome to the show, Morgan.
Thank you for having me.
Morgan, what do you make of Barack Obama's statement? Is he basically saying what the White House cannot?
Perhaps President Obama should, instead of putting his finger on the scale with respect to this conflict, this is more of a matter of self-reflection, an opportunity for his own self-reflection as we look to the crisis in the Middle East right now. The statement that he provided does not mention Iran once, perhaps because it was his own policy of appeasement that led to Iran's own rise to influence in the region. In 2012, President Obama pursued a policy of appeasement. First, he failed to enforce his own red line when the Iranian-backed Syrian regime used chemical weapons on its own people. And then in 2015, he kicked the nuclear can down the road with respect to Iran's nuclear program and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And so I think really when it comes down to this current crisis, President Obama doesn't really have a lot of credibility when it comes to strategic deterrence for the region.
Morgan, let's talk about the leaders who will be gathering later today at the UN to discuss the war. The situation in Gaza is currently alarming. Will there be any resolution? We know that there is a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza as of now.
Indeed, the humanitarian crisis is very regrettable. I would note that this is the deliberate attempt by Hamas to use civilians as human shields. These terrorists relish in the fact that these civilians are suffering. Babies on ventilators are suffering because Hamas refuses to even allow their own people security and move to the south. I think it's really important to note here that the United Nations is a hotbed of anti-Israeli bias. I don't see the United Nations being a solution to this conflict. Calling for a ceasefire right now, and Israel needs to prosecute this war and defend its own people and its territory, I think is inappropriate at this time. The United States and others have said that Israel needs to, they have Israel's back, and Israel needs to take care of this threat against their people on their own schedule.
Right, Morgan, thank you so much for all those insights, and thanks for joining us on Gravitas tonight.
Thanks for having me.